All right, welcome back. It is Tuesday. You are joining us again here on Pump Up the Volume. I'm Dr. Luis Daniel Munoz. Again, we're coming to you live from Rhode Island, where we're amplifying the voices of community and really trying to bring truth and understanding as to many of the grassroots efforts that are going on, especially now that we're still confronting COVID-19 and a lot of economic challenges, to say the least. My co-host today, as always, Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town Podcast, joining us, leading the independent media airways. We also have Mr. Roberto Gonzalez, Executive Director for Steambox Rhode Island, bringing the voice of the youth and, of course, the heart of a rebel. And we have a guest today, and someone that is taking the seat of Mr. Pat Ford, who, of course, is the founder of the Coalition Radio. But today he's helping the Libertarian presidential candidate or vice presidential candidate connect with Rhode Islanders, so he couldn't be here. But we have the pleasure and the privilege to have Mr. Scott Rotundo from WBOB, which is an independent media stream online. So that's W990 WBOB, and you can definitely check out some of Scott's content. But something else about Scott, and I think everyone on this call certainly knows that, is he is a community advocate. He is very vested in the politics within the city of Pawtucket. He cares about the community. His wife is an educator. He's very much connected with what's going on, not only in terms of information and sharing that information from a news standpoint, but also just in really looking or feeling, I would say, the effects of good policy and bad policy alike. So we're happy to have Scott on with us today. I think he's going to share some needed perspective on some local politics and other areas. But to start off, as we all know, we have a lot of stuff going on, and these issues are beginning to collide in people's lives. And the best way to talk about them is in some instances is to really separate them and to get a perspective on how things are evolving. So with that cue, thank you, producer. We're going to go ahead and hand it off. We're going to hand it off to Bill. And Bill, if you can give us a rundown of some of the latest news here in the state of Rhode Island over the past 7 days, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. And always a pleasure to be here on this great show, Pump Up the Volume with Scott Rotundo. Man, it's like adding gas to the fire right there, if ever such a thing could happen via a streaming service.
Absolutely.
But yeah, good to see you as well. Great host over at WBOB, perhaps the heart of that outlet. But real quick, this has been an interesting week for Rhode Island in a number of ways. Obviously, we're seeing the school cases rise. Just a few hours ago, Pawtucket said, we're going to go distance learning. We see 22 cases in Providence. Some schools have small clusters. So that component is still moving along kind of as you would expect it to. Big development, though, that hasn't really been reported broadly. And I just went through all the major news outlets in the state to check out and see if this had been covered in depth. But the closing of 2 of the 3 field hospitals. So now the Convention Center and the former Lowe's in North Kingstown, those 2 field hospitals are closed. So we have the Citizens Bank complex, I guess you'd say, in Garden City still as an active field hospital. But what does that say about what they're learning behind the scenes that gives them pause to say, them being the administration, to say that that's an appropriate maneuver at this point heading into the flu season? By the way, the flu today, they held a press conference outside the Department of Health making it very clear they want everybody to get a flu shot. Last year, 60% of Rhode Islanders got a flu shot. This year, they want 90%. And then lastly, we've seen the social justice marches continuing. Just last night, another march on behalf of Breonna Taylor, night 4 of a non-continuous multi-night protest that Prov X and others kind of student, and by student, I mean high school student organized protests are kind of on the docket right now. We saw a couple of arrests last night of kids, a lot of tear gas being sprayed, and an Uprise Rhode Island journalist being harassed as well by police. We also saw other members of the media in this series of protests, such as ABC6. They had their camera kicked and have been hurt. So the mainstream media is kind of being harassed by protesters. Independent media is somewhat being harassed by police. Today, Kobe Dennis organized a march, the Black Person's March, as he described it, which left from Hope High School, made its way downtown And they're a totally different vibe than what you saw last night with the student group, a much more dainty vibe to the same issues, but a lot of activity on the social justice front. And, we'll see what happens tomorrow at the press conference. As always, when it comes to these facts, I definitely am going to ask about those field hospitals, and there's a lot of money behind that, but there's got to be some strategy as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bill, for sharing that. So let me, I do want to hand this off to Scott. So let me kind of make some additions here. I think it's important to recognize that I mentioned this in a tweet yesterday. Here we are in a state that says that it's making decisions based on scientific standards, and yet we see that our ripped-up buses are allowing for 20 people within a 40-foot bus. That given the space that seats take up and steps and the driver's space, it's really less than 3 feet that people have apart. Masks will not be mandatory. They'll be recommended. And ultimately, the implication is that they have air circulation, but when it starts to snow, those windows won't be open. So again, here we are with an administration that seems to, be in pursuit of saving money in one case, possibly ensuring that there's an efficient transportation system, but again, disregarding the risk that it lays on specific communities, especially those that are dependent on transportation. Now, on the national front, it's also important to recognize that we are seeing mutations in COVID-19. We're seeing not mutations that increase the lethality of it. It's not stronger than it was before in that way, but we are seeing certain strands actually transmit more of the virus within a certain droplet. So essentially, think of it this way. If it takes one drop to get you infected today, there's a strand out there that with half a drop will give you the same amount of virus. Now, that's important to think about because obviously we see people that are loosening up. They're starting to not follow the rules. We saw a club shut down in Rhode Island that Revel that had 400 people singing songs, dancing together, no mask wearing. Think about the impact of that, not only on the people in there, but the communities that those people will go back to, the grocery store workers that they'll start to interact with, the public buses that they'll start to, enter into. So think about that. Additionally, before I hand this off to Scott, let me just say, Ben Shapiro is not a scientist. I said this on the Scott show yesterday. We have a ton of conservative podcasters out there trying to convince you all that herd immunity is possible. We have Rand Paul, politician, who's a physician, and I mean, it blows my mind, trying to convince the public that if enough of us get infected, then the disease will die with us to some extent, right? Because we'll be immune, and so the population that's most at risk will not be getting it from anyone. The truth is, we're only at 10% of the total U.S. population that has been infected. And to get herd immunity, at best, you're looking at 40% or more of the population. Now, we have over 200,000 deaths. Think about the math. Do we really want to sacrifice 800,000 lives on a theory that if 40% of the population gets infected, somehow we're going to be okay? My answer from a medical perspective is that's not a risk that I would be willing to take with human life. And so at a local level, I think that, we really in Rhode Island need to start to disclose to the public how we're thinking about risk, how we're thinking about protecting children. And so to that end, I'd love to get Scott's perspective on how, how is it to live in a city that in a time of COVID-19 is thinking about investing $400 million in a soccer stadium while also pushing children into schools for expediency. It seems like the value system is still pretty, twisted to say the least in Pawtucket, but I'd love to get your perspective, Scott.
Yeah, Dr. Munoz, first of all, thank you to all of you guys for having me on tonight. I'm really glad to be here. I think, honestly, you nailed it. There's really a dichotomy, if you think about it, about how a community in a state spends its money. Because you're right, you're looking at spending $400 million, almost $500 million on a sports stadium. And yeah, I get it. There's supposed to be tangible benefits and trickle-down benefits and all of this. But while we're still in this period of COVID-19, actually, I think, Dr. Munoz, you nailed it earlier. People listen to Ben Shapiro, and people like this as if there's some fountain of scientific advice. I like to think that I'm a smart guy. Politically, I'm independent. But I like to think that I'm smart enough to know what I don't know, and I'm smart enough to know where my competencies are and where they're not. And my competencies definitely are not on the scientific path, right? So if I'm listening to people like yourself in the medical community, in the scientific community that say COVID-19 is a danger, that warn about the potential, straw man of herd immunity, I'm much more likely to put my faith in what someone like yourself says, as opposed to someone like Ben Shapiro, who's just trying to get clicks on his show. You see what I mean? And that's what I'm really worried about in this age of quote unquote fake news is, people hear stuff that they don't want to hear and they say, oh, well, that's just fake news. To me, and I work for a scientific instruments company. When this pandemic first started, I was one of those people who thought maybe it's just a kind of a flu, it's just a really bad flu. But as my more scientifically educated friends and colleagues said to me, this is really bad, I at least had the intelligence to kind of hunker down and get the masks and get ready. And so for me, I know it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I'm just kind of disappointed that as a society, we still have the fake news and the news bite mentality to this, because it's really it's going to be shame on us in the long run. Because as you said, if we're talking about risking 800,000 lives for a theory of herd mentality, I agree with you that that's not a price that I would be willing to pay. And bringing it back to the local level, I can think of at least 400 million better uses for $400 million in the community of Pawtucket than a soccer stadium.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Scott. I mean, speaking about uses, we have school systems that are not well ventilated. Not every school in Pawtucket is Nathaniel Green, right? Newly built. We know that we need infrastructure. Cities like Providence, certainly, it's pretty clear that we need it. Pawtucket as well. And so, I'm interested, especially coming from someone whose wife is an educator. What are your biggest concerns with the current infrastructure challenges in Pawtucket today?
Well, first of all, I think the fact that every school doesn't have air conditioning is just a huge concern. I mean, think about it. We're in 2020. We're allegedly the richest and most prosperous nation in the history of the world, and all of our schools don't have air conditioning. This to me seems like a very low bar. It's just my 2 cents there. But you're right. As my wife as an educator, I'm going to look at, first of all, just having to pivot to distance learning on the fly. It's a really tough road. But I was stunned to learn that only 4 elementary schools in this city have air conditioning. That to me is basic stuff in the most prosperous nation in the world, allegedly. If children, and coming from a financial background, the biggest, if you will, and I hate to use the term, but the biggest asset that we have, not just in Pawtucket, but in the United States, is our children. We educate our children well, and they can be a shining light to the world. And to put them into such shoddy conditions is just it's outrageous to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I said this yesterday, Sal. We'd love to have your wife on the show if she's willing. It would really be great to get a perspective of an educator as well. Of course, Roberto, you are an educator as well. But, just to bring multiple educators on board and to see what the similarities are, especially seeing that we've gotten Roberto's perspective on Providence, to see whether there's some alignment in some of the challenges that teachers are facing in Pawtucket as well. I'm sure there are, but making an assumption is one thing, and actually having the facts by the people on the front lines is another. So Roberto, what are your thoughts? We messaged back and forth before this. I know that you had specific concerns. I'd love for you to share it with the audience.
Scott, welcome, and right in line with some of your messaging. Before COVID-19, there are some school buildings in Providence that when I walk into, I get sick immediately. Gilbert Stewart Middle School is a perfect example of one, because I have a light allergy to mold, but the mold presence is so dominant there that I can't I can't stay there. I can't, like, I used to do some work there. I used to participate in some of their programming. Couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. It made me sick. I had a pretty decent job with a pretty decent pay as a younger adult way back then, and I had to give it up because I was unhealthy just from stepping foot into the building. And it became obvious when I would leave the building, suddenly I'm feeling better, right? It had some effects that would last, maybe overnight, but it was certainly a lot better. Like a cloud was removed from over me as soon as I would leave the building. So, anyway, that's pre COVID 19. And it's certainly not limited to Gilbert Stewart Middle School. I mean, I went to classical. And while classical has a number of resources that I wish a lot of the other youth around the city had, the building structure is not one of them. I know they are improving. I know they're making improvements to a number of the buildings across. But anyway, uh, I'm agreeing with you that we weren't ready to meet health and safety standards before COVID-19. And I don't know what happened over the summer. I've stepped foot in some of those schools. I don't know. I didn't see anything that happened over the summer that would make me think that it's a healthy place now when it wasn't a healthy place before COVID-19. Also, I shared a message with Dr. Munoz earlier this week, and I think it illustrates um, some of the mentality and some of the strategy around containing the COVID-19 in the classrooms. Um, it was a parent who had left a message saying that they heard from another parent that their child might want to quarantine because somebody in the classroom was infected, and the parent was obviously had a lot of questions about why they weren't contacted, why they shouldn't be in quarantine when their child is in the same classroom. And the answers that went along with that messaging, and I wanted to get some clarity, so I actually asked some of the people in some of the schools that I'm working with, and they confirmed this. The messaging was that if somebody has COVID-19, if one of the students in the classroom has COVID-19, and the quarantine would then extend to the immediate people on the seating chart beside them. So think about it like a chessboard. If you were in like an X, you know what I mean, or a T shape with the student who has a confirmed case of COVID-19, then only the people immediately within 6 feet are asked to quarantine. And it's alarming to me, but another great point that Scott made, I'm not a doctor. So I'm wondering, Dr. Munoz, is that sufficient?
No, look, you know, some of the work I do, I do multiple things. Some of the work I do, though, is with the contact tracing force in Massachusetts. And I have to say that it is far more sophisticated than Rhode Island's contact tracing force, in that they have very consistent and clear protocols that address really every nuanced situation, every type of setting, congregate settings, school settings, K through 12 versus higher ed. Really, they're thinking through the steps that need to be taken and adjusting where needed, but ensuring that everything is driven by science. In Rhode Island, we have a real disconnect with that. And I've been told by some community activists that I should be very careful when I, knock RIDO, right, the Rhode Island Department of Health, when I say that they're not necessarily doing it right, because we might, be going after the wrong people. The reality is, if you're working for an administration and you have an MD or a PhD and you know science, and the administration is telling you that you need to make something happen because you need to make it happen, and you're creating marketing materials to convince the world that it's right, then from my perspective, you lost credibility. Not necessarily in your daily practice if you're taking care of patients, but you've lost credibility in terms of managing this crisis on an operational level. So let me be very clear. Yes, the standard protocol is safe. 15 minutes of exposure, right, would essentially require that you fall into that category of having to quarantine. The issue here is setting, right? The settings. Same thing with the buses. Why aren't we adjusting our protocols based on settings? Why are we allowing 20 people on a 40-foot bus? Classrooms. Why aren't we adjusting our protocols based on whether that classroom has negative pressure ventilation or not? Most classrooms don't. But let's just say that they had a stage 4 laboratory negative pressure ventilation system. Then maybe it's the case, Roberto, in that particular scenario, that if you were 10 feet away from a student, then maybe you can fall within a safe range, right? If the air were being pulled out of the room. But in a closed setting where there's no real circulation, which is it's already happening in some classrooms, it's likely going to happen into the winter when the windows are closed. Absolutely not. If you are in the same room, even if you are 12 feet apart, your risk for infection is the same. We do not have these students in plexiglass bubbles, right? Air is circulating to some extent, I would say, in that it's coming out of their mouths and it's falling. Those droplets are falling onto surfaces and falling onto other students. So I'm just trying to be very clear that I don't understand how you can stratify risk to the extent that you say that in a closed air environment, a student that is 10 feet away compared to 6 is less likely to get the disease. I mean, when you're arguing that, you're pretty much just making science up as you go, especially when we're talking about an airborne disease. So that's my answer. It's a long, drawn-out answer, but it's hard not to be frustrated when you hear these claims being made, and then you have community members that don't understand science convinced that that is true, and then modifying their lives and their daily habits to an extent where they're not necessarily reducing risk, right? They're not necessarily protecting their families any longer because they convince themselves that 10 feet is different from 6 feet.
That's exactly what I was thinking, minus the Fantastic Four negative zone room pressure stuff, because I am not smart enough to know about any of that stuff. But I would take a wild guess that some of these schools probably don't have those, and that's not exactly what's happening. I am leading up to one more question with you guys, but I want to reiterate something that I mentioned last week. Mental wellness is a huge issue among my students now more than ever, especially in this crisis. And I'm hoping that people are giving greater consideration to that than we have in the past as we're moving forward in the schools, no matter what city we're in. And I also want to point out some of the MacGyvering that's happening to stay within some of the guidelines is a little tough. For example, we've all seen an example of how people are utilizing the masks, and we've seen the chin straps, and we've seen the below the nose masks and stuff like that. I've seen that in the schools from some of the adults, from some of the teachers, and they're the ones who are modeling this for youth. Something else I've seen to go along with guidelines, I have not seen the exact guidelines. So I'm not listing any facts. I'm just telling you what I've seen. People are responding to apparent guidelines that you can have so many students in a classroom. And the way they're responding to that is by taking a standard classroom and dividing it and putting up, a makeshift barrier so that that room is now 2 rooms. So now you can double the capacity of whatever that guideline is. So the question that I think I was leading up to is, with all of this happening, right? With just the fact that some people are going back to school, and I don't want to discount the fact that very many people need schools to be open. Very many families need it. I understand that there is an equity issue involved, and I sympathize with it. But the question that I'm leading to is, with all of the situations that we've brought up so far amongst the 4 of us just in this very short conversation, who's going to be responsible if someone gets really sick? I mean, someone like, I want to say even short of death, but if a death can be directly attributed to and tied to a classroom situation when we probably shouldn't have had classroom situations, do you think this is Gina Raimondo buck stops here kind of thing? How do you think we can hold people responsible, and who do you think should be held responsible?
Yeah, look, I want to.
Go ahead.
No, Scott, you can go. I'll go after.
Okay, I didn't mean to interject, but Roberto, honestly, I would think, like in my job, I'm the financial controller of my company. So anything accounting or finance-wise, the buck stops with me. Whether it's my fault, someone else did it, whatever, I have to go in and take responsibility. And I feel like in this case, that's kind of what the governor should do. God forbid something like that happens. It's not on anybody else. It's on her. She's the leader of the state. And, she's the one kind of directing this right now. Absent the GA and absent the state Senate, she should absolutely step up and take the responsibility.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Scott. So, I kind of want to take off a little from there and go another way in saying, and let me blast a few people here, which I think it's important. Jack Reed brings multiples of millions of dollars for warfare, but a few $100,000 for community health in a time when we're facing COVID-19. So clearly, our federal delegation, while they love talking and being on the news, have not necessarily brought resources that are, I would say, specifically positioned for this crisis. Instead, it's been the CARES Act, which is pretty much an open wallet that the governor can manage and direct whatever towards whatever projects she wants within reason. But we saw that with the field hospitals, there were some issues with how this administration was allocating resources, and obviously the breakdown of the field hospital is even more concerning in terms of waste. So I want to mention that, but now I want to bring it back and to your question. On the last Equity Council call, I pointed out that there were teachers in Johnston that had family members that either were transplant patients or family members that were undergoing chemotherapy, living in the same house. And those teachers were requesting to do distance learning, and the answer was no. They could not work for no pay, or they could do in-person teaching. So I hope there's not, but there is a high risk that in fact we will see situations where there's a direct connection between a school's policy around in-person learning, which is guided by RIDE and Rhode Island Department of Health, and the death of individuals. I hope that doesn't happen. But when you're telling a person that has a child that's undergoing chemotherapy that they have to go to work, you are jeopardizing the life of that child that's at home. And that's really happening here in Rhode Island. And so when I asked the question to Dr. Alexander Scott, the answer that I received, and I wanted to ask it because I didn't know if they were aware that this was going on. So it wasn't acknowledged whether they were aware or not. All they said was, well, we have to consider the fact that some students, due to mental health concerns, they learn differently, they need to be in person. And who can refute that? But that's not an appropriate answer because it's out of context based on the question that I asked, right? Which is ultimately, are you willing to risk the lives of people that are in high risk pools so that you can somehow convince the rest of Rhode Island that everything is normal and that schools are safe? So that happened. I wish I could reach a conclusion here that made sense. I wish I could reach a point, but it's pretty open-ended, right? Like there wasn't an answer. This is going on, and Rido is the one that is actually has oversight. So while the governor is the person to blame, and we all know that should be the person if something goes wrong, I think politically we know that's not going to happen. We know that the governor is going to run for other positions. We know that there's a huge PR body built around the administration that's going to change the narrative. So even though we can sit here and have this conversation, I think this administration has historically shown that it loves to place people as heads of these departments, and the moment something goes wrong, heads fall off. So that's the pattern, and ultimately I think it's going to be the director of Rido that will be the one that will likely receive a lot of the backlash if something goes wrong, and RIDE together, especially since they're collaborating. So Bill, I'd love to get your perspective. You have studied this administration and other administrations. You understand the patterns of behavior. So I think, while I'm making some assumptions here, I think you have much more of an in-depth understanding of how this administration might react and who might, in fact, receive the blame.
Well, let's not forget, when we're thinking about modern times, all that it would take for the General Assembly to resume session is a quorum of a majority of the body to want to go back. And we've heard from folks, obviously the Republican caucus has actually been out front on this significantly. We've seen folks like Representative Lombardi come out just last week and demand that the assembly resumes via Zoom. But for those who are not agreeing to provide the oversight, right, that should go into this process from the triangular components of our government, and in a way it's now become a square, because the media, whether it's on Wednesdays or night, this isn't to necessarily even include us, but the media writ large in Rhode Island has almost filled the role of the General Assembly in checks and balances now. And so while decisions that the governor and the rest of the administration make, they may be coming from a place of pure politics, or they may be coming from a place of pure purpose, or a blend of the two. There's no one in the room to say, hey, wait a second, we need to reconsider X, Y, and Z. And so I think a lot of the blame lays on every General Assembly person who's collecting their $15,000 paycheck to stay at home right now. And outside of the budget, outside of all the other things that are being discussed in this context, the oversight provision that the General Assembly would provide here, you have to think that that would change at least the brazen direction that some of these decisions have gone in. I do believe that when you look at the Raimondo administration right now, and tomorrow she's going to be part of a summit of women. I think it's called the Century of Women, this century, the century of the 2000s, the century of women. And Governor Raimondo is going to be on a national broadcast on the Hill tomorrow at 11 a.m. She's had tons of national appearances. And, the reality is that she is really, without question, working to build that national image. So she doesn't want anything to crash here. She doesn't want to have any major obstacles in her way. So, is that her fault for having those ambitions? I'm not sure. But the result of it is everything you've all discussed and we've discussed tonight, which is there's a lot of risks with these decisions. And unfortunately, the General Assembly is not there to do their job to keep it in check.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Bill, because I think this really goes back to when you have an administration that has always looked beyond Rhode Island. And it's not the first administration to do that. Governor Raimondo is not the first governor to have ambitions, the first person to try to climb a ladder towards the national stage. But the reality is that she is a governor in the time of COVID-19, right? And so when a governor is displacing accountability, gaslighting at times, and just generally kind of disconnected with the day-to-days of reopening schools. For instance, one thing is talking about in the press conference, but I don't necessarily see the governor on the ground really trying to look at schools. And we've had governors in the past in Rhode Island that were those types of governors. They would get on the ground, right? They would do the manual labor. And so let's bring this back home. When the governor's not there to do that, then who should? And so I want to bring this back to Scott, right? So Scott, we have in Pawtucket Senator Sandra Cano, we have Representative Carlos Tobon, right? I know that there are a lot of counselors that are out there really trying to do the work, but I'm interested in knowing whether the representatives and senators of Pawtucket are actually making any headways with regards to policies and or just vision with respects to reopening of schools and healthcare infrastructure around COVID-19.
I'm really not sure. I mean, if they have, I certainly haven't heard about it. I think it's kind of par for the course, as Bill mentioned, with the GA and the state Senate, of just, everybody's kind of collecting their stipend and staying home and basically letting the governor rule by fiat. And I mean, whether she's of the same political party that you are or another political party, I think one thing we can all agree on is rule by fiat is terrible.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just find it interesting because we are in campaign season, so you see people they're just not saying anything. right? I mean, they're not really saying things of substance. And substance, from my perspective, is talking about the things Roberto's talking about, right? How are we going to protect children? The things that Bill's talking about with respects to how are we going to ensure that there's a checks and balances set up, and to call out the governor, right, for the lack of resource allocation to certain areas, such as the fact that when initially when $42 million was put out there as being money that schools could use to prepare for COVID-19 infrastructure, it wasn't delineated as funds that would have to be reimbursed and that you would have to upfront the cost. That's not how it was initially framed. And yet, after some probing, Bill, you had discovered that it was the case, right? That schools had to spend the dollar, and with school systems that don't have a dollar to spend, what does that resource actually mean for them? So, these are, yeah. Yeah, you wanted to say something, Bill? Feel free.
No, I was going to say that's exactly right. Yeah, exactly correct. Yep.
Yeah, so here we are.
It's great for schools like Barrington, but not so much for Central Falls and Pawtucket and places like this that, to your point, Dr. Munoz, might not have that money to put off up front.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are areas where I think that even if the Senate and the General Assembly are not meeting, even if they've decided to, to give up the small power that they had in the representation that they committed to, at a minimum, they should be talking about these finances, right? At a minimum, they should be, at least giving people a good perspective and understanding as to how the money is positioned, how it's released, for the most part, where it should be going. So here we're at about right now 32 minutes. I think we touched on a lot of different topics, but my hope is that our listeners would have seen an evolution of those topics, right? So we gave an overview of where we are with COVID, a kind of trend towards a potential second, some call it a third wave in the winter, how Rhode Island is responding to that, which for the most part seems to be somewhat of a limited response, which is pretty similar to what it was in the spring as well. And then, what the impact of that limited response is having on our communities, whether it relates to transportation systems, but most importantly, to our children, our youth, both outside of school systems and, of course, within school systems where the infrastructure is very poor. We've given you a national, a statewide, and a local perspective coming from out of Providence and out of Pawtucket. What we hope that you can do with that is really feel empowered enough to go out there and to start calling these local leaders out, and to ensure that the service that they committed to, they're actually going through with and doing something for their communities and challenging the system. And if they're not going to do it, then I recommend here on Pump Up the Volume that you run, you build a campaign, and then you take them out of office. So with that, I want to go around the table, give everyone 60 seconds. You can say anything you want. Shout out to your podcast, shout out to events that are taking place. Whatever you want to say, please feel free to say it. So why don't we go ahead and start with Roberto.
Oh, hi. I just had a graphic pop up. I thought it was just.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that. You can go.
I was like, oh man, we hit the nuke button. Yeah, just short and sweet. We've got to come back to conversations that we've had here before. We've talked about what defund the police actually means, and again, I understand that it's an aggressive term, and I understand that people think it's anti-police and people think it means we're not going to have police anymore. But I heard somebody in a really provocative way this week say that we need to fund the police more for trainings. And this was in a group. This was a doctor who works at a university who spoke in a group with youth. And it was really poor timing because one of the youth, I think many of us know and participates in those rallies, and had the night before been tear gassed and had that stuff in her hair. And another one of the youth who was in that group had gotten a concussion from the way that she was manhandled at a rally previously. If you don't understand what defund the police means, ask, and I'll be happy to tell you that that means while the police are still funded, we will allocate some of the other funds to take some of those other jobs off their hands, like providing more social emotional support for the communities and so much more than that. In the meantime, asking for more funding for the police in this week, especially, is probably, is going to make me want to kick you. I'm just saying. I probably won't kick you, but it's going to definitely make me want to kick you. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Roberto. And I just want to let our listeners know, so here on Pump Up the Volume, we've been so grateful to have Roberto bring the voice of the youth, voice of Providence, and just overall just a voice of an educator that is really passionate about education and where, ultimately his heart's dedicated to ensuring that the next generation is better than the last. So it's been a privilege to have you here, Roberto. Roberto has this unique opportunity coming up where he's going to be really becoming an expert in the development of nonprofit organizations. So we're happy to see him take on that opportunity and to do that in collaboration with many other community leaders. So I'm not giving a fair description of what you're doing. Feel free to do that. But I'm just trying to say, Roberto, like you're off. You're going to do something great. You're always welcome back on Pump Up the Volume. We'll all be marching together in the streets as we always do anyway. But in the meantime, I do want our listeners to know that they can find you by looking up Steambox Rhode Island, one of the leading education podcasts in the country. And through Steambox Rhode Island, I'm sure that they'll be up to date with all the happenings. That's one word. Is that what you said?
In the world.
In the world.
In the world.
Number one in education in the world. Yeah.
In the world, people. All right. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. No, sorry. So thanks for correcting me. But again, please check out the podcast. There's some amazing interviews there. I had the opportunity a few years ago of being interviewed. Just amazing stuff. So thank you, Roberto. Please come back. But in the meantime, we'll keep, we're sending good vibes your way. So next, Bill, would you like to share?
Sure. New episode of B-Town is up. We've got the one and only Bob Walsh, NEARI head. Last week we had Commissioner Infante Green on and Senator Whitehouse. So ripodcast.com. Always something there for you. Also on Twitter at Bill Bartholomew. And, we got the presidential debates coming up in just like a little over a half hour. But be interesting to see. I heard Pat Ford, the founder of the Coalition Radio, who's typically also on this program. I heard him call WPRO this afternoon and get body slammed by Dan York. And but he did try to put forth the notion that as you're and what I do agree with Pat is that on this matter is that when you're watching tonight, if you're watching tonight, by putting the emphasis on the two-party system in your own mind and not being willing to think about, hey, neither of these candidates reflect my views, that only furthers the amount of time that we are maybe not from a multi-party system, but that we're going to even have representatives in the current parties that really meet a broad set of ideals. So Pat was pitching his libertarian vice presidential candidate. He's out, Spike, I guess the guy's name is. I don't have any idea who he is. He's got to get some name recognition, I guess. But Pat's out doing that. So you give Pat a lot of credit for pushing for third-party candidates. Dr. Munoz, you know all about that as well as an independent candidate yourself, because if nothing else, it puts pressure on the stale left and right here in the political theater anyway, to start to really do a better job of representing a multitude of ideals. So there's Pat after Dan York kind of cut him off mid-comment. There it is, finishing the point for him on this show, which is, think outside the box tonight as you're watching.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bill, for reminding the listeners of that too. And to Pat's defense against Dan York, we all know that Dan York is pretty much just an establishment operative. At the end of the day, You can't really present anything that's not just a straightforward political career type candidate for Dan York without, if it's not that type of person, he disregards them. But as we all know, the times are changing, and Dan York is outdated, and Bill Bartholomew is on the rise. So just had to say that. So beyond that, I also want to say that it is important here in the state of Rhode Island that that we remember we've had third party candidates win. We've had independents specifically. I wouldn't call that a third party candidate. We've had independents win. Rhode Island is a state full of rebels and with the history of revolution, and there is still hope in the near future that we will continue that history. So keep that in mind beyond the presidential debate. Just keep it in mind for local politics. So with that, I do want to also thank Scott Rotunda for joining us. My hope, Scott, is that you'll come back. I know that you've been thinking about whether to stretch up beyond and do a little more on the live streaming. We'd love to have you back on the show here on Pump Up the Volume. But we do want to also give you time to, give whatever shout out you'd like.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you can catch my show, The Rotunda, on 990wbob.com Mondays from 8 to 9 p.m. The last episode was yesterday, and it just dropped on the website this morning. Dr. Munoz, you were a guest yesterday, and I thought we're spot on the comments on COVID. I had David Johnson calling in from Arizona, talking about his show about about veterans issues. And as Bill pointed out, we have a presidential debate coming up tonight. I would urge everybody listening tonight, whatever your political leaning, even if you're not crazy about either candidate, please tune in. Please listen to it. Please listen to the candidates. And if you're registered to vote, please go out and vote. Vote absentee if you have to. And if you're not registered yet and you can, please go out and register to vote. It is crucial. It's your right. Please get it done. Spot on, Bill.
A little show and tell.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, gentlemen. So with that, I just want to thank you all again for making this show great, for bringing all this information, all your perspectives into it, and passion, of course. And that's why we're here, right? None of us are making millions of dollars being on the show, but my hope is that those that are listening, whether it's live or on the recording, again, that you feel empowered to continue to amplify your voices, continue to challenge the establishment, and to be aware of your surroundings, especially given that we have COVID-19 and that we have misguided policies being enacted throughout our communities. But there is hope, and much of that hope comes with, again, understanding. So we'll bring you that again next Tuesday here on Pump Up the Volume. Thanks. Have a good night, gentlemen.
Take care, my friend.